When day comes, we ask ourselves, where can we find light in this never-ending shade? These words, of course, opened the captivating poem that Amanda Gorman wrote for President Biden's inauguration. And though I never give sermons titles, if I were to give this one a title, it would be called, Where Can We Find Light in This Never-Ending Shade? The shade really does feel never-ending. The darkness that we've experienced since the onset of COVID-19 is profound. The trauma is great. I don't think we've even begun processing the degree to which we are in pain. The rancor and division in this country is at an all-time high, and a symptom of that is the fact that we cannot even agree on the following statement, that a sitting president who claims that he lost an election because of election fraud, yet the claim is unfounded in 63 court cases and rejected by the Attorney General of the United States, and who nevertheless, despite this lack of evidence, asks of his vice president to subvert the Constitution. The fact that despite all of these things, we as a society cannot seem to unite in order to rebuke this brazen expression of recklessness, this is a symptom of profound division. It's a dark time. In the pure daylight, we ask ourselves, where can we find light in this never-ending shade? Now, on this Shabbat, I wanted to echo our president's call for unity, but as I listened to his words, I couldn't avoid the sense that even if he was speaking aspirationally, they just felt hollow to me. Our division is so deeply charged, and it's layered with such animosity that speaking of unity, and only unity, felt somehow a bit tone deaf to this moment. So instead, I want to talk about the darkness, the shade. I want to talk about the shade that blocks the light in the middle of the day. Now, our Parsha, the Torah this Shabbat, talks about the plague of darkness. And we tend to think of this plague as something like being nighttime in the middle of the day. It's just a lack of light. But the Torah describes the nature of this darkness in a very different way. It says, Lo ra'u ish et achiv, which literally means man did not see his brother. Man did not see his brother. V'lo kamu ish mitachtav shloshet yamim. And no one got up from his place. Nobody moved for 3 days. Now the Chidushei Harim, he connects these two ideas, these two sentiments, that people didn't see one another and nobody moved. And he suggests, in doing so, that the plague of darkness was not merely the absence of light, but it was the cruelty that descends upon society when people do not see one another. Eino mishtatef b'tsa'ar hazulat. He says, when we don't see each other, we do not join other people in their suffering. They were indifferent to the problems of their neighbors. They simply chose not to see them. And he concludes his comment by saying that when a person is indifferent to the suffering of another, nobody moves. Nobody gets up from their place. Nobody gets up to help, to change, to be a force for good in the suffering of others. And he says, for that person, ein lo tikuma, one simply can't rise. One simply can't survive and thrive. This is our plague. This is our darkness. We don't see the suffering of our fellow human beings, and they are indifferent to ours. And so I don't budge, not from my perspective, not from my truth, not from my place. Lo kamu ish mitachtav. Nobody moved. But if we live like this for too long, lo yelanu tkuma. There will be no hope for rising up. There will be no way for us to endure. So we have an answer to Amanda Gorman's question that she asked our nation to think about. Where can we find light in this never-ending shade, in this plague of darkness? Our tradition teaches in the faces of other human beings, by seeing other people. And how do we create unity? By starting to see the suffering of other people, and by moving, by acting. After George Floyd was killed, most of us engaged in the ensuing chaos and protests from a national perspective. Now, when I say most of us, I'm talking about here in our community, here at Bethel. We were watching the footage of violence from all over the country. A predictable politics emerged, and the elaborate spin machines of the right and the left, they did their work of reductionist thinking and oversimplification, and the vilification, of course, of the other side, the other team. But while all of this was happening on the national scale and the conversation was totally focused there, I was actually focused on a hyper-local response. You see, I was approached by a member of the Black community here in New Rochelle who was organizing a Black Lives Matter protest. And he told me that it would be extraordinarily meaningful to his community if the Jewish community participated and stood with them in their pain. They were planning what they were calling the Momentum March. And it was co-sponsored in the end by Young Israel, an Orthodox synagogue in town, Temple Israel, which is a Reform synagogue in town, and of course, our synagogue. Now, this march expressed New Rochelle's Black community's insistence that the racism that they endure on a regular basis must not go unnoticed. And it was a call for the recognition of injustice and the demand for dignity. Now, some of the organizers of this protest, some of the organizers of this march, they were pastors and community leaders here in New Rochelle who sat with us here in this sanctuary the day after the massacre of Jews in Pittsburgh, who were massacred for the violation of being Jewish. And they came to this shul and they stood with us and sat with us in our pain. And in addition to those individuals who came to be with us and to be with us on the following Shabbat as well, many, many of them reached out in order to express their solidarity. So of course, when I get a call like this, we said yes. And the response of our synagogue, or at least the response of some people in our synagogue to this decision was actually one of the most destabilizing times in my entire rabbinate. And it left me feeling despondent. Now, as time has passed since this happened, I can reflect a bit more dispassionately about what I think, at this point, what I think went wrong, and actually my part in that as well. You see, rather than asking me questions about the march and trying to understand the local context of the genesis of this march, the entire national debate about Black Lives Matter was mapped onto our decision. And predictable outrage emerged from folks. Black Lives Matter is anti-Semitic. Black Lives Matter is a radical leftist group that endorses violence. Black Lives Matter is anti-Israel. The list went on. But hidden in this moral outrage about our participation, hidden in this outrage about this movement for racial justice were truths and questions that ought to be interrogated. Did national Black leaders do enough to denounce the anti-Semitism that was emerging from the Black community? Is the Black community willing to wrestle with the anti-Israel and thus, in my opinion, anti-Semitic charter of the 2016 Movement for Black Lives. These are all critical questions, and we have to raise them. It's important to do that critically and without reservation. But a sweeping dismissal of the entire movement for racial justice as expressed in these popular protests felt not only unnuanced, but also meant that we as Jews were drawing a line in the sand that we could not support the Black community without demanding that they protest with hashtags and that they protest in the ways that we want them to protest. It would mean that we would be lo ra'u ish et achiv, that we would just sit back, that we would not see the suffering of our brothers and sisters. Now, in my work with the main organizer of the Momentum March, I raised these issues, and the impact was transformative. First of all, when I said that I was concerned that people would come on this march and they would bring offensive signs and chants demonizing Israel, he was totally confused. What? What does Israel have to do with the killing of unarmed Black men and racial justice? That was his response. You see, to him, the march was about Black people living in fear because of the color of their skin, and it was a march for racial justice. And that's it, nothing more. He doesn't read the Forward or the Jewish Week. He doesn't read the Jerusalem Post. He was unaware that so many Jews in a community like ours see Black Lives Matter as anti-Semitic and anti-Israel. And he unequivocally condemned all of those things and that rhetoric, and he promised to learn more about it. And then in this conversation, which was not easy, it was his turn to ask a difficult question of me. He shared that some of the other organizers were offended that we had asked if they would share the cost of security while the march was on our property. Because what they heard in that request was that the Jewish community wants security because we believe that Black people are dangerous, that they're criminals, that they'll be violent. And I laughed, and I explained to him that since people walk into synagogues and massacre Jews in prayer, we always have security when there is any kind of event in our synagogue. In fact, I told him that the prior Shabbat, there were about 25 people in the synagogue, and we had security. This is just the reality of what it means to be a Jew in 2021. He had never considered this. And why would he? His perception was that this wealthy community on the north side of New Rochelle would never in a million years feel unsafe gathering together in their own community. It was a profound moment for him, and it led him, this is remarkable, it led him to link his cause to ours. In an email to the participating organizations prior to the march, he wrote, "Friends and neighbors, the primary goals of the march are to give each other specific directions on how we can help achieve justice and foster collaboration between our communities. Let's work to end white supremacy, anti-Semitism, and anti-Blackness." It was remarkable. After our challenging conversations, he explicitly linked our cause to his cause. Not only was the march peaceful, and so many objected to our participation because it was going to be a de facto support of violence, not only was it peaceful, not only were there no slogans, no chanting, no signs that had anything remotely to do with Israel or notions that were anti-Semitic, but at the end of the march, he stood up and he thanked Beth El Synagogue Center specifically for standing with his community in this time of pain. And I am telling you, that moment was a Kiddush Hashem. In an email after the march, he wrote, "Thank you so much for being accommodating hosts. Since the first day we've been in contact, our organizers have felt the spirit of unity and did not once feel unwelcome. Even as our leaders presented concerns to one another, we had constructive and respectful dialogue while maintaining candor. Thank you again in abundance. You have created a great example of how to be an excellent ally. Shabbat Shalom." That's the power of engagement. This is the power of nuanced thinking and a willingness to state difficult perspectives and then listen resiliently. This is the power, the critical importance of stepping out of our charged partisan talking points, our slogans, and just meeting people where they are. Not only did we express solidarity with the Black community in their pain, not only did I have the chance to encourage some of their leaders to look hard at the problem of anti-Semitism among some Black activists, but they then explicitly linked this march to fighting anti-Semitism. Now, what do you think the result would have been if, when I got that phone call, I said, "I'm really sorry about your pain. I'm sorry about the trauma of your community, but we can't participate"? What do you think the impact on the relationship between this synagogue and the broader community would have been? What would it have said about our values? In order to see fellow human beings and be mishtatef b'tzar hazulat, to join them in their suffering, we have to take risks. These kumbaya notions of unity, they're not real. You can't do that work with a Facebook post or a tweet. You have to take educated and calculated risks, and they could backfire, even with all of the assurances that I was given. People could have shown up at this march with signs or chanting slogans that would have offended me and you. And I'm not talking about policy ideas that I would have disagreed with. I'm talking about people showing up with hate-filled rhetoric about the police or the white community or Israel or the Jews or you name it. There is no control over who shows up with what sign. All of that is true. And if that had happened, we would have had to figure out how to respond appropriately. But that is the risk that we have to take. That is the risk that we have to take in order to do the work of truly seeing the person who suffers and to stand with them in their pain. The business of empathy, that's really challenging work. It's not simple, and it takes courage. I cannot remember a time, I cannot remember a time in my 16 years in the rabbinate as disheartening as the months that followed this march. Months of conversations with congregants who were offended by our participation in the march. Angry emails that were sent, resignations were threatened, meetings were arranged. But what was strikingly absent from these conversations, with some exceptions, was a curiosity and an openness to listening to our thinking on this issue and to the nuances of navigating a local issue. But instead, there were furious expressions of outrage, all of which were based on these hyperbolic and oversimplified national conversations whipped up intentionally by the media, designed specifically to provoke outrage from all directions. Now, months later, I understand this perspective better. I understand this response better. And I failed. As a leader, I failed in some ways. And my leadership failure here was that I did not communicate to our community that I understood the problems of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism that exist in parts of the Black community. I did not give assurances to you, to our community, that I would never, ever work against our self-interest, nor would I work with local leaders who ignored these questions or held these positions, because I assumed wrongly that after 5 years, people here knew. They knew that I would never countenance anti-Semitism or anti-Israel rhetoric. And I was wrong. I should not have taken that for granted. And I hope that in moments like these, we can step out of this frenzied national debate. And the debate isn't really a debate. It's actually a hate-filled shouting match. And that we ask more questions. And that we're willing to take risks in order to see the suffering of those around us. It may take moral courage to be a political conservative and publicly attend a Black Lives Matter march, or simply to rebuke, among other conservatives, a president whose assault on this election was morally reckless. That takes courage. It may take moral courage to be a political liberal and to publicly state, among other Democrats, that there are legitimate reasons that would lead a person to vote for Donald Trump, and that there are legitimate problems with the ways in which the Democratic Party is shifting and changing. Calls for unity that are absent, calls to be at times unpopular on your own team, in your own party, with your own people, those calls are hollow. To move toward the light, to lift the impediments that block the light in this never-ending shade, we have to take significant risks to see one another. There will always be a reason not to act, always. Indifference is so simple to justify. Not to move from the comfort of our privilege, from our safe ideas, not to challenge ourselves, to transcend the rhetoric and try to see the humanity of others. Now, 3,000 years ago, our Torah spoke of a plague of darkness that covered the land in the middle of the day because one man, one woman, one person simply couldn't see, wouldn't see another. Let us answer this call for unity with the difficult work of seeing other people and signaling to them in word and in deed that their suffering is our suffering, that their pain is our pain. And I'll conclude with Gorman's resplendent words. When day comes, we step out of the shade, aflame and unafraid. The new dawn blooms as we free it, for there is always light, if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it. Shabbat Shalom.